He was one of the most efficient mass murderers in human history, yet he never fired a shot. His weapon was a telephone. His office was at the gates of hell, and after the war, he simply vanished, building a new life as a loving father in South America. For 15 years, he thought he'd gotten away with it. But one man, a concentration camp survivor turned Nazi hunter, would never forget his face. This is the story of Adolf Eichmann, the accountant of Auschwitz. The year is 1960, and the world, it seems, has found its breath again. In the quiet suburbs of Buenos Aires, the jacaranda trees bleed purple onto the dusty streets, and the air hangs thick with the scent of grilled meat and the distant mournful cry of a tango. Here, on Garibaldi Street, life unfolds with the simple, unhurried rhythm of the unremarkable. In a small, unassuming house, a man named Ricardo Clement returns home, his shoulders slumped with the honest fatigue of a factory worker. The day at the Mercedes-Benz plant has been long, another rotation of the great, indifferent wheel of industry. He is a ghost of a man, with a face that memory refuses to hold, thinning hair, spectacles that seem to magnify not his eyes, but his own invisibility. His children greet him with raucous affection, their small hands clinging to his trousers, their laughter a bright, untroubled melody in the dimming light. He smiles a tired, paternal smile, a gesture that seems practiced, a mask worn so long it has fused with the skin beneath. He is the image of post-war anonymity, a man who has successfully dissolved into the background of a new continent, a new life. He sits at the head of the dinner table, a quiet patriarch presiding over his modest kingdom. He listens to his wife, Vera, speak of neighborhood gossip, of the rising price of bread, of the small victories and defeats of a day lived far from the world's grand and terrible stage. He nods, he eats, he passes the salt. He is a phantom at his own feast, his presence a carefully constructed edifice built upon a foundation of ash and bone. No one in this quiet life, not even the sons who bear his name, knows that Ricardo Clement is a fiction. They do not know that beneath the guise of this humble mechanic breathes the architect of a continent's nightmare, a man whose real name is Adolf Eichmann. As evening deepens, casting long shadows that creep like old ghosts across the floor, he stands by the window. He watches the local bus rattle to a stop down the street, its headlights cutting twin beams through the dusk. It is a familiar sight, the punctuation mark at the end of another ordinary day. But tonight, a flicker of something ancient and cold stirs within him. A premonition, perhaps, or just the weary paranoia of a man who has spent 15 years looking over his shoulder. He does not know it yet, but the quiet evening is a lie. The past has finally crossed the ocean, and it is waiting for him, just beyond the glow of the streetlights, ready to claim its debt. For 15 years, Adolf Eichmann had been less a man than a rumor, a ghost whispered about in the hushed halls of justice and in the bitter memories of survivors. The hunt for him began not with the thunder of armies, but with a whisper carried across the Atlantic from Argentina. The source was improbable, a blind man named Lothar Hermann, a German Jew who had himself fled the Nazis. His daughter, Sylvia, had been dating a young man named Klaus Eichmann, who, with the careless arrogance of youth, boasted that his father had been a powerful officer in the Reich and that it was a pity he hadn't finished the job of exterminating the Jews. This chilling boast, a single thread plucked from the vast, tangled web of post-war silence, found its way to Fritz Bauer, a tenacious German prosecutor. Bauer, distrustful of the old Nazi sympathizers still festering within the German system, secretly passed the information not to his own government, but to Israel. The intelligence landed on the desk of Isser Harel, the formidable director of the Mossad. Harel, a man forged in the fires of espionage, was cautious. False leads were a plague, phantom sightings of wanted men a cruel and common sport. But this lead felt different. It had the raw, unpolished texture of truth. A team of agents, the very best of the Mossad's Kidon, Spearhead Unit, was dispatched to Buenos Aires, melting into the city like ghosts hunting a ghost. Their mission: to watch, to wait, and to be certain. They became shadows on Garibaldi Street, their eyes chronicling the mundane life of Ricardo Clement. They watched him leave for work, return home, and potter in his garden. The man was a specter of normality. Was this truly the monster they sought? Doubt gnawed at them. The moment of absolute certainty arrived not with a confession, but with a bouquet of flowers. The agents knew from old files the date of Adolf and Vera Eichmann's wedding anniversary. On that exact day, March 21, 1960, the agents watched as Ricardo Clement stepped off the bus carrying flowers for his wife. It was a small, human gesture that served as a signature on a death warrant. The Phantom now had a face. The hunt was over. The capture was about to begin. On the evening of May 11, 1960, the trap was set. A cool dampness clung to the air as Eichmann's bus once again rumbled to its stop. As he walked the final 100 yards toward his home, a black sedan feigned a breakdown. An agent, the legendary Peter Malkin, approached him. "Un momentito, señor." "One moment, sir." In that sliver of hesitation, the world turned. Malkin, a man whose own family had been consumed by the machine Eichmann had engineered, lunged. Eichmann let out a terrified shriek, a sound more animal than human, before he was wrestled to the ground, a gloved hand stuffed in his mouth to prevent him from using a hidden cyanide pill. He was bundled into the car, and it sped away into the darkness. The ghost, the architect of the final solution, was now flesh and blood. A trembling, captive secret hidden in a suburban safe house, the world entirely unaware that history had just held its breath and changed its course. Before the name Eichmann became a synonym for methodical slaughter, it belonged to a boy born in Solingen, Germany, and raised in the shadow of the same Austrian city, Linz, that had cradled Adolf Hitler. Yet, there was no fire in the young Adolf Eichmann's belly, no spark of the fanaticism that would later consume the world. His was a soul cast in shades of gray. His father, a respectable and meticulous accountant, passed down to his son not a legacy of hatred, but a far more mundane inheritance, a reverence for order, numbers, and the clean, impartial logic of a ledger. His youth was a long, unremarkable symphony of mediocrity. He was neither a brilliant student nor a troubled delinquent. He was simply present. A ghost in the classroom, a footnote in the memories of his peers. He drifted through his education, an academic ship without a rudder, eventually dropping out of vocational school without a trade or a purpose. He was a man without qualities, a vessel waiting to be filled, a blank page upon which any ideology, no matter how monstrous, could be written. His professional life began as a series of stumbles. He failed to find his footing in his father's mining company. He then found a kind of rhythm as a traveling salesman for the vacuum oil company, crisscrossing the Austrian countryside. Here, in the lonely drone of his car on dusty roads and the forced smiles of transactional encounters, the seeds of his future were sown. He learned about logistics, about routes and schedules, about moving a product from one point to another. But he was never a master salesman. He lacked the charm, the charisma, the human touch. He was a joiner, a man who sought refuge in fraternities and clubs, desperately seeking the very thing he lacked within himself, an identity. The Great Depression swept away his modest career, leaving him unemployed and adrift at the age of 26. He was a failure. The world had judged him and found him wanting. He carried his mediocrity like an ill-fitting suit, a constant, chafing reminder of his own insignificance. It was in this vacuum of self-worth that a fateful invitation arrived. A family friend, a rising figure in the Austrian Nazi Party named Ernst Kaltenbrunner, suggested he join the SS. It was not presented as a call to ideological war, but as a practical solution, a career opportunity. For a man drowning in his own inadequacy, the black uniform of the SS was not a symbol of evil. It was a life raft. It was a chance to finally belong, to be given a purpose, to stop being a nobody and become a gear in a grand, terrifying machine. When Adolf Eichmann pulled on the black uniform of the Schutzstaffel, SS, for the first time, he did not feel the stirrings of a monstrous destiny. He felt, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, the simple, profound relief of belonging. The wool was crisp, the cut severe, the silver death's head insignia a stark promise of identity. For a man who was a void, the uniform was an exoskeleton, providing the structure and definition he could not generate himself. He was no longer Adolf Eichmann, the failed salesman. He was SS man number 45326, a quantifiable part of a powerful, ascendant whole. His journey into the heart of darkness began not with a bang, but with the rustle of papers. His first post was at the Dachau concentration camp, yet he was no jackbooted sadist patrolling the wire fences. He was a clerk, assigned to the tedious administration of the camp's bureaucracy. His world was not the screams of prisoners, but the rhythmic click of the typewriter, the neat columns of ledgers, the sterile satisfaction of a well-organized file. He was insulated from the human horror by a wall of paperwork, a barrier that would become the defining feature of his entire career. He was learning, in these early days, to see people as entries, as numbers, as logistical problems to be managed. He was a man of limited imagination and even more limited ambition, but he possessed a clerk's diligence. This pedestrian competence was his only real talent, and in the burgeoning bureaucracy of the Third Reich, it was a valuable commodity. He was transferred to the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, the intelligence arm of the SS, and shuffled into a newly created section in Berlin, Section 2-112, the Department for Jewish Affairs. It was an assignment born of bureaucratic randomness, not of any pre-existing fervent anti-Semitism on his part. The Jewish question was handed to him like any other file folder, a problem to be studied, categorized, and solved with administrative efficiency. Here, in the sterile corridors of the SD headquarters, the empty man found his calling. He approached his new subject with the obsessive pedantry of a stamp collector. He began to study. He read Zionist literature. He learned the basics of Hebrew and Yiddish, not out of any desire for cultural understanding, but to better understand the mechanisms of his assigned problem. He became an expert, not in the rich tapestry of Jewish life, but in the organizational structures of Jewish communities. He could map their charities, their political groups, their emigration patterns. He was a cartographer of his future victims, drawing up the maps that would later guide them to their doom. The embrace of the Black Order was complete. The void had been filled, and the unremarkable failure had finally found his purpose. He would be the system's most diligent, most efficient, and most soulless functionary. The annexation of Austria in 1938, the Anschluss, was the moment the theoretical became brutally practical. When the tanks of the Wehrmacht rolled into Vienna, Adolf Eichmann followed not far behind, not as a conqueror with a sword, but as a bureaucrat with a briefcase. Vienna, with its vibrant, centuries-old Jewish community of nearly 200,000 souls, was to become his laboratory. He had studied the Jewish question in the dusty archives of Berlin. Now, he was tasked with solving it. His mission? To purge the city of its Jews through forced emigration, and to do it with unprecedented speed and efficiency. In Vienna, the failed salesman finally found his product: human despair. He established the Central Office for Jewish Emigration, a bureaucratic masterpiece of cruelty. It was a one-stop shop for dispossession and exile. Here, he perfected a merciless assembly line. Jews were stripped of their property, their businesses, their assets, all liquidated to finance their own expulsion. They were forced through a labyrinth of paperwork, a humiliating gauntlet of stamps and signatures, each one a small death of their former lives. It was Eichmann who orchestrated this entire process, forcing the leaders of the Jewish community to become cogs in his machine, compelling them to help organize the queues and schedules of their own people's flight. Here, for the first time, Eichmann tasted real, intoxicating power. He was no longer a faceless clerk. In his Vienna office, he was a god in a well-pressed suit. He sat behind his polished desk as prominent doctors, lawyers, and businessmen, men who would never have glanced his way in his previous life, stood before him as beggars, pleading for the papers that were their only hope of survival. He discovered he was good at this. He thrived on the order, the control, the tangible results. In just a few months, he processed tens of thousands of people, turning a vibrant community into a logistical success story. His ruthless efficiency did not go unnoticed. His superiors, chief among them, the cold, calculating Reinhard Heydrich, were deeply impressed. The Vienna model was hailed as a triumph of administrative ingenuity. Eichmann's reputation was forged. He was no longer just a student of the Jewish question. He was its foremost specialist, the indispensable man who could get things done. He was summoned back to Berlin and then to Prague to replicate his success. But as his methods became the standard across the expanding Reich, the world began to shut its doors. Emigration, his signature solution, was becoming impossible. The specialist, having perfected the art of forcing people out, was about to be tasked with a far more final solution. His expertise was about to be repurposed for a new, unspeakable objective. In the labyrinthine corridors of the Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, on Berlin's Prinz Albrechtstrasse, there existed a department whose designation was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obscurity, Referat 4B4. The title was deliberately bland, smelling of ink and paper clips, suggesting nothing more sinister than tax collection or resource management. But this office was the nerve center of the apocalypse. It was Adolf Eichmann's kingdom, a small realm of desks and telephones from which he would orchestrate the logistics of the greatest mass murder in human history. This was not a place of shouting fanatics or blood-spattered torturers. It was a place of quiet, methodical work. The air was thick with the scent of cheap cigars and the incessant ringing of telephones. Maps, crisscrossed with railway lines, adorned the walls. The desks were buried under mountains of documents, transport lists, population statistics, inventories of confiscated property, and timetables, endless, meticulous timetables. Eichmann, now an SS Obersturmbannführer, lieutenant colonel, presided over it all, a spider at the center of a continental web. He waged his war not with a rifle, but with a fountain pen. His bullets were decrees, his battlefields were railway junctions. The work of Department 4B4 was the accounting of death. Its employees were not killers in the conventional sense. They were transportation managers, statisticians, and clerks. They spoke a chillingly sterile language, a vocabulary of evasion that scrubbed the blood from the words. People were not people. They were Stücke, pieces, units, or cargo. Deportation was resettlement, or evacuation. The goal was not murder, it was to meet a quota. The Holocaust, from the perspective of this office, was a vast, complex logistical problem to be solved with maximum efficiency. Eichmann was its chief operating officer. The decision to annihilate the Jews of Europe had been made in a stately villa at Wannsee, a resolution passed over cognac and cigars by the Reich's elite. But it was in Department 4B4 that this abstract decree became a concrete, operational reality. It was Eichmann who haggled with the Ministry of Transport for locomotives and cattle cars. It was Eichmann who coordinated with SS commanders on the ground to ensure that the shipments were ready when the trains arrived. It was Eichmann who, with a tap of his finger on a map, could redirect the flow of human lives from a ghetto in Poland to the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. He was the master scheduler of the final solution, and he took a perverse professional pride in his work, boasting of his ability to clear entire cities like a sanitation department. From behind his desk, the man who had failed at everything else had finally found his expertise. He was the world's foremost administrator of genocide. Power is a potent drug, and for Adolf Eichmann, the man who had lived a life starved of influence, its effects were transformative. The quiet, diligent clerk began to fade, replaced by a man intoxicated with his own importance. He was no longer merely a servant of the system. He was its master conductor, standing on a podium of corpses, orchestrating a symphony of death that spanned a continent. The rumble of 1,000 trains on 1,000 different tracks was music to his ears, a rhythm he alone controlled. He was the lord of the schedules, and his domain was the steel arteries of Europe. He discovered that his signature on a transport order was more powerful than a general's command on the battlefield. He, a mere lieutenant colonel of the bureaucracy, would stand toe-to-toe with decorated Wehrmacht generals, his voice cold and insistent. He argued not over tactics or territory, but over railway timetables. His trains, laden with human misery, took precedence over troop transports and supply convoys. The war on the Eastern Front could wait. The war against the Jews could not. This was his personal crusade, and he pursued it with the zeal of a fanatic. The intoxication drove him from behind his desk. He became a tourist of the apocalypse, embarking on inspection tours to witness his grand design in action. He walked through the ghettos of Łódź and Warsaw, not with horror, but with the detached gaze of a factory manager inspecting a production line, noting inefficiencies and bottlenecks. He traveled to the death camps, including Auschwitz, to observe the processing of his human cargo. He was not a sadist who delighted in the suffering. That would have required an emotional connection he did not possess. Instead, he was a craftsman admiring his handiwork, clinically assessing the efficiency of the gas chambers and the crematoria. He would later recall being impressed by the smoothness of the operation. Back in Berlin, or in his field headquarters in Budapest and Prague, he cultivated the persona of a powerful man. He drank heavily, boasted loudly among his SS comrades, and relished the fear and deference his title commanded. He was a king in his own macabre domain, a small man casting a colossal shadow built from train cars and timetables. The man who had been a vacuum was now filled to the brim with a toxic sense of self-importance. He was no longer just following orders. He was the driving force, the engine of the final solution, pushing it forward with a relentless, obsessive energy. The Lord of the Schedules was ready for his magnum opus. By the spring of 1944, the Third Reich was a magnificent beast bleeding out from 1,000 wounds. The Red Army ground relentlessly from the east. The Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy in the west. The air was filled with the roar of enemy bombers and the stench of defeat. For any rational man in the German High Command, the only remaining questions were of survival and surrender. But Adolf Eichmann was not a rational man. While the empire crumbled around him, he embarked upon his masterpiece. Hungary, an uneasy ally of Germany, had managed to protect its large Jewish population of nearly 800,000. It was the last great, untapped reservoir of victims, an unforgivable oversight in Eichmann's ledger. In March 1944, as German forces occupied Hungary, Eichmann arrived in Budapest with his small team of specialists, the Sondereinsatzkommando. He was a man with a singular, frenzied purpose: to complete the final solution while there was still time. He was racing against the collapse of the front, a reaper trying to harvest his final field before the coming storm. What followed was an act of genocide so compressed and ferocious it defied imagination. Eichmann, at the absolute zenith of his power, unleashed a logistical blitzkrieg. He operated with the terrifying energy of a man possessed. He bullied and flattered Hungarian officials, turning their own gendarmerie into the brutal instruments of his will. The ghettos were sealed, the roundups conducted with stunning speed. The railway lines of Hungary became a conveyor belt to death. Day after day, 4 trains, each packed with over 3,000 souls, would depart for the gas chambers of Auschwitz. In just 56 days, from May 15th to July 9th, Eichmann and his commandos deported over 437,000 Hungarian Jews. It was an average of nearly 8,000 people a day. The machine he had built was now running at a fever pitch, a monstrous engine consuming human lives with flawless, horrifying efficiency. So obsessed was Eichmann with his task that when Heinrich Himmler himself, seeing the war was lost and hoping to use the remaining Jews as a bargaining chip with the Allies, ordered the transports to stop, Eichmann tried to defy the order. He was no longer a cog. He was a flywheel, spinning with a momentum all its own. This was his bloody triumph. He had proven that even with the world crashing down, his system worked. He had erased a community from the map in less time than it takes for a season to change. He would later speak of it with the chilling pride of a master craftsman who has completed his life's work. The Hungarian apocalypse was not a crime to him. It was a crowning achievement, the final, perfect entry in his accounting of death. In the spring of 1945, the Wagnerian opera of the Third Reich reached its cataclysmic finale. The cities were infernos of rubble, the Führer was a jawbone in a shell crater, and the men who had once fancied themselves gods were now either dead, captured, or scurrying for cover like rats from a burning ship. For Adolf Eichmann, the lord of the schedules, the music of the trains had stopped. The vast, intricate web he had controlled was torn to shreds. His power, once absolute, evaporated into the sulphurous air. He shed his SS uniform like a snake sheds its skin, attempting to dissolve back into the anonymity from which he had come. Captured by American forces, he gave a false name, SS Untersturmführer Otto Eckmann, a deliberate demotion to appear as an insignificant nobody. In the sprawling, chaotic POW camps of post-war Germany, he was just another face in a sea of defeated men. For a time, it worked. The master accountant of the Holocaust was lost in the careless accounting of the victors. But as the name Eichmann began to be spoken with increasing frequency at the Nuremberg trials, he knew the thin veil of his disguise would not hold. He escaped. For the next few years, the man who had commanded a continental genocide lived a life of profound obscurity, hiding in plain sight. He worked as a forester in the German countryside, the man who had moved millions of people now felling trees in the silent solitude of the woods. He was a ghost in his own land, haunted by the specter of his own name. But Germany was not safe. The hunt was on. He needed to disappear completely. His salvation came through a shadowy, subterranean network known as the Rat Lines. This clandestine railroad, operated by a network of Nazi sympathizers and sympathetic clergy within the Catholic Church, was a pathway to a new world. Following its secret map, Eichmann made his way south, a pilgrim on a journey to escape judgment. He moved through Austria, the land of his youth, and crossed the Alps into Italy. In a monastery, a place of sanctuary, the architect of godless slaughter found shelter. With the help of a Franciscan monk, he obtained a refugee passport issued by the International Red Cross. The name on the document was Ricardo Clement, a Catholic of Tyrolean origin. Adolf Eichmann was officially dead, buried under a pile of forged papers and whispered blessings. In the bustling port of Genoa, he boarded the steamship Giovanna C., a faceless man among a crowd of hopeful emigrants bound for Argentina. As the ship pulled away from the shores of Europe, he did not look back. He was sailing away from the ashes of his kingdom toward a quiet life built upon a mountain of bones. In 1961, Jerusalem became the world's courtroom. The trial of Adolf Eichmann was to be more than a legal proceeding. It was a stage for the ghosts of a continent, a final, desperate attempt to impose human reason on an inhuman crime. The world's press descended, and television cameras, a new and powerful force, prepared to broadcast the proceedings globally. For the first time, the Holocaust would have a face, and humanity leaned in, expecting to see the face of the devil himself. And then they saw him. He was led into the courtroom not in chains, but in a civilian suit that seemed a size too large. He was placed inside a specially constructed, bulletproof glass box, a cage designed to protect him from assassins, but which served as a perfect metaphor for his existence. He was a specimen under a microscope, a man on display, forever separated from the humanity he had sought to destroy. The world looked into that box, and it did not see a monster. It saw a balding, middle-aged man with thin lips, horn-rimmed glasses, and a nervous twitch in his cheek. He looked like an accountant, a minor official, a man you wouldn't notice on a bus. The banality of his appearance was the trial's first profound shock. The prosecution, led by Attorney General Gideon Hausner, set the tone in his thunderous opening. "When I stand before you here, judges of Israel, to lead the prosecution of Adolf Eichmann," he declared, his voice echoing through the silent hall, "I am not standing alone. With me are 6 million prosecutors, but they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger, for their ashes are piled up on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka." It was a declaration that this was not a trial of one man, but the trial of a crime against the very soul of humanity. For months, the court became a vessel for memory. A procession of 112 witnesses, survivors from every corner of the hell Eichmann had engineered, took the stand. They were no longer the statistics from his ledgers. They were men and women who had watched their families turn to smoke, who had survived on scraps of bread and hope in a world made of mud and wire. They spoke, many for the first time, of horrors that language was not built to describe. The courtroom filled with their stories, a torrent of grief and rage that washed over the man in the glass box. And through it all, Eichmann sat, diligently taking notes, blowing his nose, and looking less like a man confronting his sins and more like a clerk auditing a poorly managed account. He seemed concerned not with the moral weight of his actions, but with the procedural accuracy of the testimony against him. The architect of the apocalypse was still, and always would be, a bureaucrat. When the time came for the man in the glass box to speak, the world leaned in, expecting the roar of a demon or the hiss of a serpent. It braced for a torrent of hateful ideology or a defiant, unrepentant confession. What it heard instead was the dry, tedious rustle of a bureaucrat's ledger. Adolf Eichmann spoke for hours, his voice a flat monotone, weaving a defense that was more bewildering than enraging. It was a mantra of non-responsibility. His argument was simple, consistent, and chilling. He had never personally harmed a single Jew. He was not, he insisted, a rabid anti-Semite. He was a civil servant. He had only ever followed orders. Befehl ist Befehl. He claimed he was merely a small cog in the machine, a transportation officer concerned with timetables and logistics, not with the final destination. The great crime, he implied, was the responsibility of the great men above him, the Hitlers and the Himmlers. His only sin was obedience, a virtue that had been drilled into him his entire life. He even made the bizarre claim that he had lived his life according to Immanuel Kant's moral imperative of duty, twisting a profound philosophical concept into a shield for mass murder. The world was perplexed. This was not the face of evil they had imagined. This was the face of a functionary, a man who spoke in clichés and bureaucratic jargon, seemingly incapable of grasping the enormity of his actions. It was in this moment of collective confusion that one observer in the courtroom, the German Jewish political philosopher Hannah Arendt, saw something else entirely. Reporting on the trial for The New Yorker, she formulated a concept that would forever change the world's understanding of wrongdoing. She called it the banality of evil. Arendt's revolutionary insight was not that the crime was banal. The Holocaust was a rupture in human history, an act of absolute evil. Rather, it was the criminal who was banal. Eichmann was not a Shakespearean villain driven by monstrous ambition or sadistic glee. The terrifying truth, Arendt argued, was his thoughtlessness. He was a man utterly incapable of thinking from the perspective of others. His evil was not born of malice, but of a vacuum where a conscience should be. He was a joiner, a conformist, a man whose professional diligence and loyalty were completely detached from any moral reality. This was the true horror of Eichmann. The lesson was not that a monster had orchestrated the Holocaust, but that an ordinary, mediocre, and frighteningly normal man had done so, simply by doing his job with bureaucratic zeal. Arendt's theory was a firestorm. Many wanted Eichmann to be a devil because it was comforting. It placed him outside the realm of normal humanity. Arendt's diagnosis suggested that the potential for such evil was not extraordinary, but terrifyingly ordinary, lying dormant in any system that allows thoughtless men to become its instruments. The judges, 3 men who had themselves fled German persecution, did not accept the defense of the small cog. On December 15, 1961, Adolf Eichmann was found guilty on 15 charges, including crimes against humanity, crimes against the Jewish people, and war crimes. The court concluded that he was not merely following orders, he was a key architect, a man who had acted with fanatical zeal and an inner conviction. The verdict was death. He appealed, but the verdict was upheld. He petitioned the President of Israel for clemency, writing, "There is a need to draw a line between the leaders responsible and the people like me, forced to serve as mere instruments in their hands." The plea was a final, hollow echo of his testimony. It was rejected. In the final moments of May 31, 1962, inside a prison in Ramla, Adolf Eichmann walked to the gallows. The man who had presided over the industrial slaughter of millions faced his own singular death. He refused the traditional black hood. He wanted to face his end with open eyes. His final words were not of remorse or confession, but of a strange, disjointed grandiosity. He spoke of Germany, of Argentina, of Austria, declaring he would not forget them. His very last sentence was, "Lang lebe Deutschland, lang lebe Argentinien, lang lebe Österreich, ich werde sie nicht vergessen." Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria, I shall not forget them. It was the final testament of a man still lost in his own hollow identity, clinging to the nations that had defined him, even as he was being erased. At the stroke of midnight, the trapdoor sprung. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered over the Mediterranean Sea, beyond Israel's territorial waters. It was a final act of accounting, ensuring that no grave would ever become a shrine, no final resting place would ever exist for the man who had denied so many a final resting place. The story of Adolf Eichmann, however, did not end with the snap of his neck or the dispersal of his ashes. His true legacy is the chilling question that echoes from his glass box, a question that haunts the modern world. It is the eternal echo of the banality of evil. Eichmann became a permanent warning, a terrifying monument to the fact that the greatest atrocities in history are not always committed by monsters foaming at the mouth. They are committed by ordinary men, by bureaucrats who prize efficiency over empathy, by functionaries who surrender their conscience to the perceived authority of a system. He taught the world that evil does not always require passion or hatred to flourish. Sometimes, all it needs is a desk, a telephone, a timetable, and a man who refuses to think. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like, subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos. There are more amazing stories to come. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.